It was February in Nebraska, the kind of cold that doesn't ease. Hank Coleman stood on the porch before the sun came up. He'd done it every morning since he was 9. The boards under his boots were the same boards. The nails were the same nails. His grandfather had driven those nails in 1908. 4 generations. That was the number he kept turning over. Solomon, who'd walked off a Tennessee plantation in '62, and didn't stop walking until he hit the Niobrara. Isaiah, who'd buried 2 children and a wife in the back pasture and still kept planting in the spring. Joseph, who'd come home from France in '46 with a piece of mortar in his hip and farmed for 25 more years without complaining about it once. And now him, 61 years old, the last one. The land lay flat and white in front of him, 240 acres. The home quarter was the original Solomon claim. The other quarter Isaiah had bought in 1919 for $1 an acre after the Spanish flu took the white family next door. Hank knew every fold of it. He knew where the stones came up in spring, and where the deer crossed in fall, and where the cottonwood his great-grandmother had planted leaned a little to the south because of how the wind hit it. He didn't own it anymore. That was the new fact. He kept setting it down beside himself and picking it up again. The papers had come in January. The auction was set for the last Sunday in February, 3 weeks. Inside, Ruth was making coffee. He could smell it through the kitchen window. 40 years of mornings he had smelled that coffee. She came out with a mug for him and stood beside him without saying anything for a long time. "Did you sleep?" she said. "Some." "You didn't." "Some." She looked out at the land with him. "It's still ours today," she said. "Yes, then today is what we have." He drank the coffee. It was hot and bitter and made the cold in his chest sit a little easier. Ruth went back inside. The sky started to turn that gray color it gets just before light, and Hank Coleman stood on his porch and breathed slowly in and out, the way his father had taught him to do when something hard was coming, and waited for the day. The Colemans had been in Nebraska longer than most of the families who looked at them sideways in town. Solomon walked into the territory in the spring of 1862. He was 23 years old. He didn't have shoes for the last 100 miles. The story in the family was that a Pawnee woman named Star fed him squash on the side of a creek and pointed him north, and that's how he ended up in the Niobrara country. He worked 7 years before he had enough to file a claim under the Homestead Act. He filed in 1882. He was 43. He built the soddy himself, then the frame house in 1894, and that frame house was the back 2 rooms of the house Hank lived in now. Solomon married Cora, who'd come up from Mississippi. She had 9 children. 6 survived. The youngest was Isaiah. Isaiah took over in 1916. He bought their second quarter section in 1919 and added another 20 acres in 1925 that he later lost in the dust. He buried his first wife in 1923 and his 2 oldest in 1926. He married again, a woman named Pearl, and they had 4 children. The youngest was Joseph. Joseph went to war in '43. He fought in the 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers. He came home in '46 with a piece of mortar in his right hip and a quietness he kept the rest of his life. Hank had asked him once, when Hank was 14, what the war had been like. Joseph had thought about it for a long time. Then he'd said, "Son, they wanted us to fight a war for them. They didn't want us to come home and want anything for ourselves." Hank had not understood that until he was 30. By the time he was 40, he understood it the way you understand the weather. Joseph farmed until 1971, and then he sat down on the porch one June afternoon and didn't get up. The doctor said it was his heart. Hank thought it was his hip and his quiet finally finding each other. So now it was Hank. There had been other black families in the county once. Small communities up in the sandhills, mostly, that had thinned out through the 20s and 30s. Most of those families gave up and moved to Omaha or Lincoln or Chicago. By the time Hank was a boy in the 40s, the Colemans were the only black family left within 30 miles. By the time he was a man, they were the only black family left in the whole county. He'd never thought of leaving. The land was Solomon's whole life. You didn't sell that. You didn't move off that. You died in the house your grandfather built, and you left the place in better shape than you found it, and you handed it to your child. Except Hank didn't have a child on the farm. He had Sarah, 32 now, a banking lawyer in Chicago. She'd been good in school the way her grandmother had been good in school. Quietly, ferociously, and she had gone to college and law school and married a good man named Andre Banks and given Hank a grandson named Michael, who was 8 years old. Sarah came home twice a year. She'd asked once, when she was 19, if Hank thought she should come back to the farm. Hank had said no. He'd said it before he'd thought about it. He'd said, "You go where you can be a person. The land will be here." He'd meant it then. He still meant it. But it sat strange on him now, the thought that the land might not be there much longer. The bad years had started in 81. That was the hail. June 14th. He remembered the date because it was the day before his anniversary. The corn was knee-high. The storm came out of the southwest, and it took an hour, and it stripped the fields down to dirt. He stood in the rain afterward and looked at it, and felt nothing for a while, because nothing was the right thing to feel. Then he went inside and ate dinner with Ruth, and didn't say anything about it until morning. Insurance covered some, not much. The adjuster who came out was a man named Lowell Hardy from a company in Lincoln. He walked the field with Hank for 10 minutes and wrote down a number that was about a third of what the white farmer 2 miles south got for the same storm. Hank knew this because the white farmer was a decent man named Pete Olson, who told him plainly. "I don't know why they're doing that to you, Hank," Pete had said. "But they're doing it." Hank had thanked him for the truth and not pushed it, because pushing it would have meant lawyers and money and time, and he didn't have any of those things. That was 81. 82 was the drought. It started in May and didn't break until October. The corn went brown by July. The beans were nothing. He had grain in the bin from a good 80 he'd been holding for the right price. That was Rudy Stenlin's old trick, but he had to sell it to make the spring loan payment, and he sold it in August, which was the wrong month, and he took the loss. 83 was the prices. There wasn't anything that happened to 83 except the prices. Corn went to $2. 40. Beans were $5.60. The interest rate on his operating loan was 18%. He'd taken that loan at 12, and it adjusted, and the bank manager Roland Barkley had told him with a smile that there was nothing anyone could do. That's what the market said. Hank had asked about restructuring. Barkley had said they'd see. They didn't see. By the end of 83, Hank owed the bank $92,000 on the operating side, and another $48,000 on the mortgage. He had $800 in checking. The bin was empty. The freezer in the basement had 2 hogs in it and most of last year's beef, and that was all the food they were going to get for the next 8 months. He went to see Roland Barkley in January. Barkley was 45. He'd been the bank manager for 9 years. He kept his hair combed in a particular way, with a part on the left, and he wore the same kind of brown suit every day, and he had a habit of clicking a ballpoint pen while he talked. Hank sat across the desk from him. Barkley clicked the pen. "Hank," he said, "Roland, you know I've been in your corner. I know you've said that." Barkley frowned a little at that and clicked the pen. "Look, the board's been over your file. There's nothing we can do. You're underwater on the operating. The mortgage is current, but the operating's secured against the land too, and we'd be looking at a loss on resale even at a forced sale. You see how that works? I see how it works. We've been talking to other producers in your situation. We're offering some of them workouts, restructuring, but your situation's a little different. Different how? Risk profile. What's my risk profile? Hank, look, I don't make these decisions alone. The board's they've been looking at things. They feel like the future of certain kinds of operations is uncertain, especially smaller acreage like yours. Niche operations. My operation's the same as Pete Olson's operation, Roland. Pete's situation is different. How is it different? Barkley didn't answer that. He clicked the pen. Hank sat still and looked at Barkley across the desk and felt a thing he had felt many times in his life. It was a particular kind of tiredness. The tiredness that came from being told a lie you both knew was a lie, by a man who couldn't say the true reason out loud. All right, Hank said. I'm sorry, Hank, all right. He stood up. Barkley stood up. They didn't shake hands. Hank walked out through the lobby, past the teller who didn't look at him, past Mrs. Pemberton at the loan desk, who did look at him with sympathy that was almost worse than not looking. And he got in his truck and drove the 7 miles home and didn't say anything about it to Ruth until that evening. The notice came in the mail 9 days later. The Cadillac came down the drive on a Tuesday morning. It was black. Hank watched it from the kitchen window. He'd seen Cadillacs before. He'd never seen one come down his drive. The car came slowly because the drive was rutted and the man driving it didn't want to scrape the bottom. Hank put on his coat and went outside. The man who got out was younger than Hank had expected. Maybe 45. He had hair that looked like it had been cut in a city. He wore a tan overcoat over a gray suit. His shoes were polished. He stood in Hank's drive and smiled like he had practiced smiling in a mirror. Mr. Coleman? Yes, Preston Calloway. I'm with Cattleman's Equity Group. He held out his hand. Hank looked at it for a second, longer than was polite, and then shook it. What can I do for you, Mr. Calloway? I was hoping we could talk a few minutes about your situation, my situation, with the bank. We work with families like yours during this kind of transition. I think we could help each other. Hank looked at him. Come in. Ruth was at the table grading papers. She taught 4th grade in town. She'd done that for 30 years. She looked up when Calloway walked in, and her face did the thing her face did when she was deciding whether to smile or not. She decided not to smile. She nodded and went back to her papers. Calloway sat at the table. Hank poured him a cup of coffee. Calloway didn't drink it, he said. Mr. Coleman, I'm going to be straight with you because I think you'd appreciate that. The bank's going to take this place. The auction's set for the 26th. 3 weeks. The bank is going to take a loss on that auction because no real producer in this market is going to bid the kind of number you'd need to clear the loan. So somebody's going to get this land cheap. The question is who? All right. My company would like to make you an offer. Today, cash, $80,000. You walk away with $80,000 in your pocket. You pay off the operating. You have a little left. You find a small place somewhere. My company has rentals all over, and you start over without the weight of this on you. You don't have to stand there at that auction and watch your neighbors look at you. You don't have to do that to your wife. He paused. He had practiced this part too. He had practiced the part about the wife. I think you're a good man, Mr. Coleman. I think the world has been hard on you. I'd like to make it a little easier. Hank watched him. He sipped his coffee. What does Cattleman's Equity Group do with the land, Mr. Calloway? We hold a portfolio. We work with larger operators on lease arrangements. Eventually, some of these properties go to development. It depends on the market. Development, industrial agriculture, possibly residential in some markets down the line. This isn't a residential market, not yet. Hank set the cup down. Mr. Calloway, what did you offer the Schultz place? Calloway's face changed a half-inch. The Schultz situation was different. Yes, he's white. There was a silence at the table. Calloway smiled the practiced smile. Mr. Coleman, I understand that this is a sensitive time for you. I'm not here to insult you. I'm here to help. 80,000, cash, today. You offered the Schultzes 120. I'm not at liberty to discuss other clients. I know what you offered. Vern Schultz told me himself. He turned you down. Then he's a fool. He's a free man with land of his own. Calloway's smile got smaller. Mr. Coleman, with respect, in 3 weeks you won't be a man with land of your own either. I'm offering you a way out. I heard you. I'd like an answer. You have one. I'd like a different one. You won't get one. Ruth had stopped grading papers. She wasn't looking up. She was sitting with her pen still on the paper. Calloway looked at her, then at Hank, then at the cup of coffee he hadn't touched. Then he stood up. I'll leave my card, in case you change your mind. I won't. Things change, Mr. Coleman. Some things don't. Calloway put his card on the table and walked out. Hank watched the Cadillac back down the drive and turn onto the county road and disappear behind the windbreak of cottonwoods that Solomon had planted in 1888. Then he came back inside and sat down at the table across from Ruth. She reached over and took his hand. 80,000, she said. Yes, he thought you'd take it. Yes, he thought 80,000 was a number you'd take. Yes. She squeezed his hand once and let go and went back to her papers. Hank picked up the card. It was thick stock, embossed letters. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he tore it once and once again and dropped the pieces in the wood stove and watched them go. Hank called Sarah that night. He had not planned to. He had told Ruth that morning at breakfast that he wasn't going to tell Sarah. He had said, "She's busy. She's got the boy. I don't want her in this." Ruth had said, "She's your daughter, Henry. She's also a lawyer. She'll try to fix it. There's nothing to fix." But after Preston Calloway left, after the card had gone in the stove, Hank sat at the table for a long time and looked at his hands, and then he got up and went to the phone in the hall and dialed the long-distance number from memory. Sarah picked up on the second ring. Daddy, Sarah. She knew immediately. She knew because he had not called her on a Tuesday in 15 years. What is it? He told her. He told her in 5 sentences. He had practiced them in his head while the phone was ringing. 3 bad seasons, the bank, the auction. 26. Someone had come by today with an offer. There was a long pause on the line. Daddy, yes, I'm coming home. No, I'm coming home. No, Sarah, Daddy, you will not come home for this. You hear me. I did not raise you to come home for this. Daddy, I'm a lawyer. There are things I can do. There aren't. There might be. There aren't, Sarah. The papers are already filed. The auction is on the calendar. You can't get inside the boxes from outside the state. You'd come home and you'd cry, and you'd embarrass yourself in front of Roland Barkley, and you'd accomplish nothing. So you will stay where you are. You will go to your office. You will kiss my grandson. You will not come home until April. Do you hear me? There was another long pause. Daddy, are you all right? Yes, you don't sound it. I am all right. Mama? Mama is all right. Daddy, yes, I love you. I know, baby. I love you, and I'm going to do something even if you don't want me to. Sarah. I'm not going to come home. I won't. But I'm going to do something. Don't ask what. I won't tell you. I just want you to know I'm not going to sit here in Chicago with my hands folded. He smiled faintly. You are your mother's child, Sarah. I know I am. All right, don't do anything stupid. I won't. I love you. I love you, Daddy. He hung up. He went back to the kitchen. Ruth was at the table. She looked up. You called her, I called her. How is she? She's going to do something. What? I don't know. She wouldn't tell me. Ruth nodded slowly. That girl? Yes. He sat down. They didn't say anything for a while. Then Ruth said, maybe what she does will help. Maybe, or maybe it won't. Maybe. Either way. He drank the rest of his coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway. In Chicago that night, Sarah Coleman Banks did not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table in her 2-bedroom in Hyde Park with a yellow legal pad and a glass of water. Andre had put Michael to bed at 8. Andre was a public defender. He had seen his wife's face when she came out of the hall after the call, and he had not asked. He had only said, "Tell me when you're ready." Then he had taken the boy into the back room and read to him. Sarah could hear them faintly through the wall. Andre's voice doing the bear in the picture book, Michael laughing the way he laughed only with his father, a small, loose laugh that had nothing held back in it. She sat at the table and listened to the laugh, and she did not know for a moment why she was about to cry. Then she did know. She was about to cry because somewhere in Crawford County, Nebraska, a man who had not laughed that way in 50 years was sitting in a kitchen with the same wife she remembered from her childhood, deciding to lose a thing that her great-great-great-grandfather had walked across a country without shoes to claim. And she had been told not to come home, and she was not going to come home, but she was not going to do nothing. She wrote on the pad, Cattleman's Equity Group, Riverside Bank of Crawford, Roland Barkley, Preston Calloway. Sarah's law firm was Brennan, Whitaker and Lowe. She had been there 4 years. She did banking compliance, the dull work of making sure regional lenders followed federal rules. It was not glamorous. It paid for the apartment. The thing it gave her that she had not understood was a gift until that night was that she knew where to look. She knew that every state-chartered bank in Nebraska had to file an annual ownership report with the State Banking Commission. She knew that those reports were public. She knew that holding companies could obscure ownership, but that the obscuring left a paper trail, and that the paper trail was a pattern, and that the pattern could be read. She started reading. She picked up the phone at 10 p.m. Central Time and called a man named Daniel Mercer, who had been her classmate at Northwestern Law and who now worked at a banking firm in Lincoln. She had not spoken to him in 18 months. He answered on the 3rd ring. She apologized for the hour. He said, "Sarah, what is it?" She said, "I need you to pull the ownership filings for Riverside Bank of Crawford." He said, "Now?" She said, "Now." He said, "Sarah." She said, "Daniel, my father's farm is being foreclosed on by that bank in 3 weeks. I think there's something there. I can't tell you everything yet. I just need you to pull the filings. Pro bono, as a friend. I will owe you anything you want for the rest of my life." There was a pause on the line. He said, "I'll pull them in the morning. I'll call you by noon." She said, "Thank you." She did not sleep. She sat at the table until 2, and then she went to the back room and stood in the doorway and watched her son sleep. He was on his side with one arm thrown out across the blanket, the way his grandfather slept, the way her father had slept the few times she had seen him sleep as a child, and she stood and watched him and thought, "I am doing this for him." Then she thought, "No, I am doing this because I am my father's daughter, and I will not sit here in a city and watch this happen. The boy is the reason, I will tell myself later. The reason now is something I have no word for." She went back to the kitchen and made more coffee. At 7 a.m. Chicago time, she had the legal pad full. At 11:30, her phone rang. Daniel said, "Sarah, are you sitting down?" She sat down. He said, "The majority shareholder of Riverside Bank of Crawford is a holding company in Lincoln called Whitmore Holdings. Whitmore Holdings is 65% owned by an irrevocable trust set up in 1968 by a woman named Eleanor Whitmore. She is the widow of the bank's founder. She is 73 years old. She lives 9 miles from your father's farm. She has not exercised her control in 14 years. But she could. Sarah closed her eyes. She said, "Daniel, can you put me in contact with her counsel?" He said, "I already did. I called him this morning. His name is Leland Marcus. He has agreed to take the call when you're ready." She said, "Daniel." He said, "I know." She said, "Daniel, why?" He said, "Because in the second year of law school you sat with me for 6 hours the night before the corporation's final and made me understand piercing the corporate veil. I told you then that I would owe you. I have remembered." She thanked him. She hung up. She called Leland Marcus. That conversation lasted 40 minutes. At the end of it, Leland Marcus said, "Mrs. Banks, I'd like to ask you to hold the line. I'd like Mrs. Whitmore to hear what you've just told me, from you. She is at my office this afternoon for another matter. With your permission, I will call you back at 4 o'clock Central Time and put her on the phone." Sarah said, "Yes, sir." He called back at 4. Eleanor Whitmore came on the line. She said, "Mrs. Banks." Sarah said, "Mrs. Whitmore." Eleanor said, "Tell me about your father." Sarah told her, not about the bank, about her father, about Solomon walking, about Joseph and Korea, and Joseph at the Lincoln Parade in 53, about the cottonwood, about what Hank had said the night before in 5 sentences, about what Hank had said when she'd offered to come home. Eleanor was quiet for a long time at the end. Then she said, "Mrs. Banks, I would like you to know that I knew your grandfather. Not well. My husband knew him. There is a story in my house that I intend to tell to a friend tomorrow. The story is older than you are. I would like you to know that what you have done in 3 days is the work I should have done 15 years ago, and it has been done in the right time anyway, because the world arranges these things in the right time when it is going to arrange them at all. Please do not come home. Your father does not want you to, and I do not want you to. He needs to walk into that square as a man, not as a man whose daughter flew home. You have already done the work. Now you let it work." Sarah said, "Yes, ma'am." Eleanor said, "And Mrs. Banks?" "Yes, ma'am, you have a son. Yes, ma'am, tell him about Sunday, when he is old enough. Tell him his mother sat at a kitchen table for 3 nights and did not sleep." "Yes, ma'am." She hung up. She did not tell her father about any of it. She did not tell anyone for a long time. The week after Preston Calloway, things got smaller and meaner. It started at Crocker Implement on a Wednesday. Hank needed a part for the John Deere. The drive belt had given out, and even though he wasn't going to be plowing anything that month, he needed the tractor running for the auction. The bank wanted the equipment in working order to bid as part of the sale. He drove into town with $62 in his wallet and the part number on a piece of paper. Wayne Crocker was behind the counter. Wayne was 40. He'd taken over from his father. His father had sold to Joseph Coleman for 30 years. Wayne had sold to Hank for the last 12. Hank put the paper on the counter. "Need this one, Wayne." Wayne looked at the paper without picking it up. "Cash up front. I always pay net 30, Wayne. Policies changed." "Since when?" Wayne shrugged. "Look, Hank, I heard about, word gets around. We can't extend on accounts that are in transition. Pete Olson owes you $400. He's behind 2 months. He's still buying parts. Pete's situation is different." It was the same line. The exact same line. Hank had heard it twice now in 2 weeks, from 2 different white men, and the words had slid into the same shape. "Different how, Wayne?" Wayne didn't answer. He picked up the paper finally and looked at it. $22.50 for the belt. Cash. Hank counted out $22.50. Wayne went into the back. He came out with a belt. He set it on the counter without a bag. Hank picked it up. "Thanks, Wayne." "Yeah. Tell your dad I said hello." "My dad's dead, Hank." "I know he is." He turned and walked out. In the parking lot, a man named Dale Falstead was getting out of a truck. The truck had a Confederate flag in the back window. The flag was new. Hank had seen the truck without it the month before. Dale Falstead was 60. He'd lived 2 miles from Hank his whole life. They had played catch as boys in 1932, before Dale's father had told Dale to stop playing with the colored kid down the road. Dale saw Hank. Dale didn't nod. Hank nodded anyway. He drove home. Ruth was the one who told someone. She didn't tell Hank she was going to. She wouldn't have asked his permission, and he wouldn't have given it. He had decided early, the day the notice came, that he was going to lose the farm with his mouth shut. He was going to walk through the auction and hand over the keys and not ask anyone for anything. That was the kind of man he was. That was the kind of man Joseph Coleman had been, and Isaiah and Solomon and the Colemans had not survived 120 years in this country by asking white people for help. But Ruth wasn't a Coleman by blood. She was a Coleman by choice, and she had a different idea about what dignity meant. She drove into town on a Thursday morning to drop off a casserole at the Lutheran church. The Lutheran church was where the Stenlands went. She wasn't a member. She went to the AM mission 30 miles east when the weather allowed. But she'd been bringing a casserole to the Lutheran Funeral Committee for 20 years. Because Mary Stenland's mother had brought a casserole to the Coleman house when Hank's mother died in 1968, and Ruth had decided that was a debt that didn't end. Mary Stenland was in the church kitchen. She was 64. She had hands like rope. She and Ruth had been friends quietly, the way wives sometimes were when their husbands' worlds did not overlap. This was one of the moments of full clarity. "Mary," Ruth said. She set the casserole down. She put her hand on the counter. "We're losing the place." Mary looked at her. "When the 26th?" Mary didn't say anything for a second. Then she said, "Does Rudy know?" "No, you want him to know." "I don't want anything, Mary. I'm telling you because you're my friend." Mary nodded, slow. She picked up the casserole and put it in the freezer the way she would any other day. She dried her hands on her apron. "You drive home careful," she said. "I will. It's icy." "I know." Ruth got back in her car. She did not start the engine right away. She sat in the parking lot of the Lutheran church and put both her hands on the wheel and looked at the cross above the door. She thought, "I have just told a woman a thing my husband asked me not to tell anyone." She thought, "I have done it because I love him, and because loving him means being willing to be wrong on his behalf." She thought, "He will be angry. He may stay angry for a long time. That is the price," she thought. "There are prices a wife pays. There are prices a husband does not get to choose for her." She started the engine. She drove home. She did not tell Hank. That night, Mary Stenland told Rudy. Rudy was 66, a thin man with a face like weathered cedar and eyes that had been the same blue color since 1923. He'd farmed his father's place since he was 19, and he had never asked anyone for anything in his life, and he had never done a thing he was ashamed of, and he'd known Hank Coleman for 40 years. They weren't close. Rudy wasn't close with anyone except Mary, but he had stood in his own field one day in 1957 when his combine had rolled, and Hank Coleman had been the second man there, and the first man had been Joseph Coleman, who at 65 had run a quarter-mile across plowed ground to get to him. Rudy had not forgotten that. He listened to Mary at the kitchen table. He didn't interrupt. When she was done, he sat for a while and looked at his coffee. Then he said, All right what? I'll handle it. How?" "I don't know yet, but I'll handle it." He got up from the table and put his coat on and went out into the cold. Rudy didn't go to Hank that night. He went to Eugene Pratt. Eugene Pratt was 71. He lived alone since his wife had died in 79. His son Eugene Jr., who was 40, lived in town and ran the hardware store, and didn't come out to the place much anymore. Eugene Sr. had been a machinist in the Navy in '44, and he had kept a shop in his barn ever since, and there was almost no piece of farm equipment in the county he couldn't fix. He was a big man, even at 71, and he had hands like something carved out of a stump, and he was the quietest man Rudy knew. Rudy knocked. Eugene came to the door in suspenders over an undershirt. "Rudy, Gene, come in." They sat at Eugene's table. Eugene poured 2 cups of coffee from a percolator that had been on the stove since 1968. Rudy told him about Hank. Eugene listened. When Rudy was done, Eugene didn't say anything for a minute. Then he said, "You want to do a penny?" "I want to try, that's the old way. I know it is. Hasn't been done in this county since the '30s. I know." Eugene drank his coffee. "You'd need 100 men, maybe more, to make it work. I know. You'd need them to stand. You couldn't have them shifting around. You couldn't have them looking nervous. The whole thing only works if they stand." "I know, Gene. You'd need somebody to make the bid." I'll make the bid." "And you'd need somebody to stand at the front so they can see. Somebody big enough that the city men think twice." Rudy looked at him. "Yes." Eugene drank his coffee. "I got the chain," he said. "I figured. I haven't pulled it out in 30-some years. I'd have to oil it." "You have time. 3 weeks, yes." Eugene looked at his coffee, then at Rudy, then at his hands. "My boy isn't going to like it, I know. He's been working in town. He's got a different way of seeing things now. He thinks the old ways are. He thinks we should let things take their course. What do you think?" "I think Hank Coleman is a man, and his daddy was a man, and his granddaddy was a man. And if we're going to let the city take a man's farm because he's been 3 years unlucky and a different color, then we're not the kind of place I thought we were." He set the cup down. "I'll oil the chain tomorrow." "Thank you, Gene. Don't thank me. Just don't lose your nerve." "I won't. And don't tell Hank. I wasn't going to." "Good. He'd say no. He'd say no out of pride, and he'd be right to. We do this for ourselves, not for him." Rudy looked at him. "That's an interesting way to put it." "It's the only way to put it. If we do it for him, he owes us something. If we do it for ourselves, we don't ask him for anything. That's the difference between charity and citizenship." Rudy nodded. He put his cup down. He stood up. "I'm going to start knocking on doors tomorrow." "How many?" 200. Eugene whistled. "In 3 weeks. Yes, that's a lot of doors." "I know. Some of them won't open. Most of them won't. I know. Some of them will open and you'll wish they hadn't. I know that too. All right then." Rudy put his coat on. Eugene walked him to the door. At the door, Eugene said, "Rudy, yeah, it might not work. I know. He might lose it anyway." "I know. You ready for that?" Rudy thought about it. "I'm ready to have tried." Eugene nodded. "That's the right answer." Rudy went out into the cold and got in his truck and drove home, and the next morning he started knocking on doors. He started at Carl Hoffman's. Carl was 81, the surviving Hoffman brother. Dean had hung himself in the hay barn. In '81, the winter the operating loan came due, and the wheat was at $3. 20 and Dean couldn't see a way out. Carl had been the one who found him. Carl had buried his brother and gone home, and not said a word about it for 3 weeks. Then he'd shown up at Rudy's place one morning, with a cup of coffee in his hand and said, "I'm not going to be hard to live with. I just need to sit." And he had sat at Rudy's kitchen table for 2 hours and then gone home, and that had been the whole funeral. Carl opened the door at 6 in the morning. He had been up since 4. He always was. "Rudy, Carl, got a minute?" "Got a few." They sat at the kitchen table. The kitchen had not been changed since Carl's mother had decorated it in 1937. There was a sign over the door, hand-painted, that said, "A man without debt is, a man wounds himself." It had been there since Carl was a boy. He'd painted it again in 1962 because the original had faded. Rudy looked at it now the way he had looked at it for 40 years. Hank Coleman's place, Rudy said. Carl nodded once. I heard. How? Mary Stenlin told Pearl Westcott, told Tommy, told me. 3 days ago. You knew when I came in here. I knew. You didn't come find me. I figured you'd come find me. Rudy almost smiled. I want to do a penny. Carl looked at him. He looked at him for a long moment. His eyes were the color of weak coffee. They had always been kind, and Rudy had never been able to tell, in 50 years of friendship, whether Carl knew that they were kind or not. I'll come, Carl said. You'll stand. I'll stand. You sure? I lost my brother in 81 because he didn't ask anybody for help, Rudy. I'm not going to let another man go down for the same reason. This isn't quite the same. No, it's worse. Hank's a better farmer than Dean ever was, and he didn't get sick. He just got squeezed by the same thing that squeezed Dean and 3 other men I knew, and the bank let some of them out and not him, and we both know why. Rudy nodded. Who else? You been to Pratt's? Last night. He in? Chain and all. Carl exhaled through his nose. It was the closest thing to a laugh Carl made anymore. All right, try Drennan next, then Whitmore, then Roy Hassel, then Heights. They'll all come. You won't have to ask Heights twice. He's been waiting a long time for a fight he could pick. What happened to Heights? Carl looked up at him. You don't remember. Remember what? 79, the summer. Rudy thought. The bet, the tractor north dealer? Yes, Edna Kowalski, yes, he gave her $10,000 in one envelope. At 3 a.m, I was there. I drove him. Rudy looked at Carl. You drove him? He'd been drinking, just enough that I wouldn't let him drive. Not enough that he didn't know what he was doing. He knocked on her door. She didn't answer at first. He said, Edna, it's Eugene Heights. Open the door. I have something for you. She opened the door. He gave her the envelope. He said, I won this off a man who deserved to lose it. You take this. The bank will leave you alone. She tried to give it back. He walked away. He got back in my truck. He didn't say anything for the whole drive home. Carl looked at his coffee. He's been waiting ever since for the next one, the next Edna, the next chance to win something off the men who deserve to lose it. You won't have to ask him twice, Rudy. You'll have to ask him to step back so other men can stand too. Rudy nodded. What about the Falstead place? Carl shook his head slowly. Don't waste your time. He used to play with Hank when they were boys. That's what he used to do, Rudy. It's not what he does. His father was a decent man. His father is dead. Rudy nodded. Crane? Don't go to Crane. He'd want to know. He'd want to know so he could call somebody. I'm telling you. Don't. Crane's in the clan? Crane's in something. Maybe not the clan. Something newer. There's a thing now, came out of Idaho, calling itself the Order or the Brotherhood, I don't know. Crane had a brochure on his coffee table when I was over there in November. I saw it. I haven't been back. Rudy sat with that. All right, skip Crane, skip Falstead, skip the Petersons. The boys are no good now. Go to everybody else. That's still 150 houses. Then start driving. Rudy stood up. Carl stayed sitting. Carl, yeah, thank you. Don't thank me, Rudy, like Eugene said. We do this for ourselves. He paused, and for Dean, Rudy went out into the cold. 3 weeks is 21 days. Rudy drove 12 hours a day for 16 of them. He went to every farm in Crawford County that wasn't Crane, and wasn't Falstead, and wasn't Peterson, and a few that were on the edge of those families and might still be reachable. He drank coffee in 203 kitchens. He stood in barns and in mudrooms and on porches in 12 degrees of cold. He explained, each time the same way. There was a man in this county whose family had been here 120 years, and the bank was going to take his place on the 26th. And the bank was going to take it because he had been unluck for 3 seasons, and because of one other reason that didn't need to be said out loud. And the men in this county had a tool for this kind of thing, and the tool was the penny auction. And Rudy was just asking, was a man could only ask whether they would come stand on the morning of the 26th and not bid against a single penny. Some of them said yes before he finished. Walter Drennan said yes at the door, 82. He didn't even take his coat off. He said, when and where? Eleanor Whitmore said yes from a wing chair in her parlor, with a cup of tea in her hand and a face like a cathedral. She said, I have not stood in the open in 20 years, Rudolph Stenland. I will stand for that man. She did not explain about the bank. Not yet. Carl Gentry said yes while he was digging. He was 76, and he was hand-digging a well in February because the weather did not stop him. He set down his shovel and looked up out of the hole and said, tell me the time and I'll be there. Rudy told him. Carl picked up the shovel. Then he set it down again and looked up. Rudy, he said, tell Hank Coleman something for me. Tell him I dug a well on his great-grandfather's place in 1938. I was 20. Solomon was old. He paid me in food. I have not forgotten what kind of bread Cora Coleman made. You tell him that. Rudy said he would. Carl picked up the shovel and went back to digging. Harold Finch said yes while he was reading. Walter Gunderson said yes while he was looking at his clover field, which was under snow, which he was looking at anyway. Roy Hassel said yes from inside a dismantled tractor, where Rudy had to wait for him to climb out from under the axle. Eugene Heights said yes before Rudy finished the sentence, and then he said, who's putting up the penny? I'll put up the penny. I want the penny on me. Chester Holloway said yes, and offered to drive his crawler tractor to the auction site as a precaution. Rudy thanked him and said no, the crawler wasn't going to be necessary, and Chester said all right, and didn't argue, but Rudy could tell Chester was disappointed. Tommy Westcott said yes and added something else. Tommy was 67, the auctioneer. He had been the auctioneer for the county for 28 years. He stuttered when he wasn't on the bid stand. On the bid stand, he didn't. Rudy hadn't even thought to ask him. He'd assumed Tommy would already be the one calling the bids on the 26th. But Tommy raised his hand at his own kitchen table when Rudy was halfway through and said, Rudy, you don't have to ask. I'm calling that auction. I know you are, Tommy. I'll do it right. I know you will. I want you to know I'll do it right. Tommy, I know. I've been calling auctions for 28 years. The bank can't tell me how to call. I'll call what I see. You'll call what you see. Yes. All right. Tommy's wife, Pearl, was at the stove. She didn't turn around. She just said quietly, he's been waiting his whole life to call this one, Rudy. Rudy didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. Some doors closed. The Olson place was the first one Rudy didn't expect to lose. Pete Olson had been the man who told Hank about the insurance adjuster in 81. Rudy stood on Pete's porch on the 7th day, and Pete listened and shook his head before Rudy was done. I can't, Rudy. Pete. My boy, he's working in Lincoln. He's got a job at the elevator. He brought home a girl last summer and they're going to get married, and I can't make trouble, Rudy. They got him on a list at work for promotion. He says they're funny about families that get involved in things. This isn't a thing, Pete. This is your neighbor. Hank's not my neighbor, Rudy. He's 2 miles south. I see him at the elevator twice a year. You stood for him in 81. I told him a thing. That's not the same as standing in a yard with my hand in my pocket telling Cattleman's Equity Group to back off. Pete wouldn't look at him. Rudy waited a minute. Then he said, All right, Pete. You're a good man, Rudy. All right, Pete. He walked back to his truck. The second one that hurt was the Brennan place. Tom Brennan was 60. He had 3 sons. He had 410 acres. He listened to Rudy from his side of the kitchen table with his arms folded. "Why are you doing this, Rudy?" "Because it needs doing." "It doesn't need doing. The man's been farming for 30 years, and he's got nothing to show for it. That tells you something." "It tells me he had 3 bad seasons in a row, Tom. It tells me other things." Rudy looked at him. "Like what?" "Like maybe some operations don't belong out here. Maybe some and look, Rudy, I'm not going to say a word and against him personally. He's a man, fine, but maybe we don't need to be propping up every operation that fails. The market's got a way of clearing things out." "That's the market." "That's not the market, Tom. That's the bank." "The bank's part of the market." The bank gave Vern Schultz a workout. Schultz had collateral. So did Hank. Hank has more collateral than Schultz. He just has the wrong. Rudy stopped himself. He had nearly said it. He had nearly said, "He just has the wrong skin." Tom watched him stop. Tom knew what he had nearly said. "Best you go now, Rudy." Rudy stood up. "Sorry to take your time, Tom." He walked out. He sat in his truck in Tom Brennan's driveway for a long time before he started the engine. He looked at his hands on the wheel. He thought about the years. He thought about all the times he had sat in that kitchen with Tom and his wife Margaret and the boys when they were young. He thought about how he had not seen this in Tom. He had not seen it. And the not seeing had been a kind of comfort, a kind of agreement, a kind of small and quiet lie that they had made together for 40 years. He started the engine and drove on. The third door that closed was the worst one, because it was the door Rudy had thought he would not need to knock on at all. It was Eugene Pratt's son. Eugene Jr. had inherited nothing yet. He still rented his house in town. He ran a hardware store. He came out to his father's place once a month on Sundays for dinner. The Sunday after Rudy started knocking, Eugene Jr. was at his father's table, and Rudy was there because his father had asked him to come. Eugene Jr. listened. He set his fork down. He looked at his father and not at Rudy. "Pop, don't start, Eugene, Pop. I'm 40 years old. I have a son." "I know you have a son. He's my grandson. I taught him how to drive a stick when he was 11. Don't tell me about your son." "Pop, you're going to stand at a public auction with a chain on your shoulder. There's going to be cameras. The bank has a man with a camera. The county paper sends somebody. There will be photographs of you with a chain in 1984. Yes. And we'll be in those photographs forever, Pop. Our family will be in those photographs. Yes, you think the customers in my store don't read the paper? I think you sell hammers, Eugene. Hammers don't care. People care, Pop. People remember. There are people who'd stop coming to the store if they saw that picture. Then those people don't deserve hammers." Eugene Jr. looked at him for a long time. "Pop," he said, "when did you start being like this?" "I've always been like this." You stopped looking. There was a silence. Eugene Jr. stood up. He put on his coat. He looked at Rudy. "You did this," he said. "No, son," Eugene Sr. said. "I did this 40 years ago." Rudy just opened the door. Eugene Jr. left. Eugene Sr. sat at the table for a long time. Then he picked up his fork and ate the rest of his dinner. Rudy ate too. They didn't talk for a while. After dinner, Eugene Sr. said quietly, "He'll come around, or he won't. Either way, I'm pulling that chain out of the barn tomorrow." "All right, Gene, you go on home." "All right." Rudy went home. On the 18th day, Rudy went to see Eleanor Whitmore. He had been to her once already. That had been the second visit on his list, and she had said yes inside the first 10 minutes. But he came back on the 18th day because of a feeling he could not put words to, but which he had learned over 40 years of farming to listen to. The feeling was this: the auction was going to come down to one moment. 200 men in a yard would be a lot of weight, But Preston Calloway was a man who had been in courtrooms, and a man who had been in courtrooms was not a man who was easily moved by weight. He would have a lawyer. He might have a sheriff. He might have an arrangement with Roland Barkley, who had to follow procedure, and procedure could be bent into instruments. Rudy needed something else. He didn't know what. Eleanor was in her parlor, 73. Her husband had died in 1971. She wore a wool dress that was the same color as the curtains, and she sat in a wing chair with her ankles crossed, and she watched Rudy take his hat off and sit down across from her without saying anything for a while. "Tea, please." She poured him a cup. "Eleanor," he said, "Rudolph, I want to ask you a question I have no right to ask. Then it's the right kind of question. It's about the bank." She set her teacup down carefully. "Yes. Is it true?" "Is what true? That you own the bank?" She looked at him for a long moment. "My husband owned 6.5% of the bank when he died, Rudolph. 6.5% is not what I'm hearing. What are you hearing?" "I'm hearing 6.5% plus the holding company in his mother's name, plus the irrevocable trust he set up in 68, makes 65%. Eleanor's mouth made a small shape that was almost but not quite a smile. "Who told you that?" "A man at the Savings and Loan in Lincoln. He used to do business with your husband's mother. He's 84 now. He came up to me at the elevator last fall and said you were the most powerful woman west of Omaha and didn't know it. I know it. I figured. I don't speak about it. Why? Because the moment a woman speaks of her power, men begin to think of how to take it from her." Rudy nodded slowly. "Is it true, Eleanor?" "Yes. All of it. Yes. You could move the bank." "I could remove the manager, Roland Barkley." "Yes, you could call the loan. I could not call this loan. The loan is what it is. But I could ensure that the bank was not represented at the auction by a man with an arrangement." "How?" "My counsel in Lincoln is calling a special session of the board for Friday, the 24th, 2 days before the auction. The agenda will be a single item. By the close of business that day, Roland Barkley will know that any deviation from posted procedure on Sunday will be the first item at the meeting that follows." Rudy looked at her. "You'd do that?" "I'm not going to do it before I have to. I'm not going to spend it on something that 200 men can fix. 200 men is the right tool, Rudolph. My piece of paper is a different tool. You don't bring 2 tools to the same fight unless the first one needs the second one to work. And does it? I think so. I think procedure will fail without the call. So the call goes, all right, there is one more thing, Rudolph. Yes. I had a phone call yesterday. From my counsel, he had been on the line with a young woman in Chicago. Her name is Sarah Banks. She is Hank Coleman's daughter. She found the bank ownership through public filings. She is a banking lawyer. She had done in 3 days by herself, with a yellow legal pad, the work my counsel was about to do. He read what she sent and called me. He said he had not been so impressed by a young attorney's work in 20 years. He asked me to come to his office. I went. I spoke to her on the telephone for 30 minutes. She told me about her father. She told me about Solomon walking. She did not ask me for anything. She told me to do what I thought right. I told her I admired her. She said, "My father raised me. I am only doing what he raised me to do." Rudy stared at her. "Sarah, yes. Hank's daughter, yes." Eleanor smiled faintly. "He raised her well, Rudolph. He doesn't know." "No." She told me he asked her not to come home and not to interfere. She agreed not to come home. She did not agree to the second part. She told me on the telephone that her father was a stubborn man and that stubbornness was a virtue, but it was not the only virtue, and that she was going to do what she could do. I told her I admired her. She told me she had 3 days off her job and a yellow legal pad, and that was all she had. I told her that was usually enough. Eleanor set her teacup down. "Don't tell anyone, Rudolph. I won't. Not even Eugene. Not even Eugene. Especially not Hank. Why especially? Because Hank Coleman should walk into that auction tomorrow as a man who is being defended by his neighbors, not a man who is being saved by an old woman with stock certificates and a daughter in Chicago. Those are different stories. He gets to be the man in the first one. We get to be helpers in the second one. He needs to be the man on Sunday. Sunday is for him. Rudy stared at her. You think long, Eleanor. I have had a long life. He nodded. He stood up. He took his hat. At the door he turned. Eleanor. Yes. Why do you do this? She looked at him. Why do I do what? Why do you stand for him? You don't know him. You've shaken his hand twice in your life. Why? She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, my husband went to school with Joseph Coleman. They were in the 8th grade together at the country school. There was a teacher who treated Joseph badly. My husband came home and told his mother. His mother went to the school, and that teacher was gone in 3 weeks. My husband told me that story the night before he died. He said, I never told Joseph what my mother did. Then he said, you take care of that family, Eleanor, if it ever comes to it. I thought he was being foolish on his deathbed. He had a habit of being foolish at the end, but he wasn't this time. He was setting a clock. Rudy stood in the door. Joseph never knew. No, Hank doesn't know. No, and you're telling me. I'm telling you because you have to know what tomorrow is, Rudolph. Tomorrow is something that started 50 years ago. You are the last hands on a thing that has been moving for 50 years. I want you to know that. I want you to stand there knowing it. He nodded once. He could not speak. He went out. The Sunday before the auction was a Sunday. Hank and Ruth drove the 30 miles to the AIM mission. They went once a month, always. They had gone for 40 years. The mission was a clapboard building set on a corner in a town where there had been a black community in the 1900s, and where there was, in 1984, a congregation of about 14 elderly people and a young pastor named James Whitfield who drove down from Omaha each weekend. Pastor Whitfield was 31. He had grown up in Detroit. He had been to seminary in Atlanta. He had taken the mission because no one else would. He preached short sermons, and he visited shut-ins twice a week, even when the snow was high, and he had taken Hank Coleman aside on the day Hank's mother died in 1968 and said, Mr. Coleman, I'm sorry, I'm here, whenever. Hank had not forgotten that. Hank had been 45 then. Pastor Whitfield had been 15, on a Sunday visit with his uncle, who was the pastor before him. Now Pastor Whitfield was the pastor. He preached on Mark that Sunday. He preached on the woman with the alabaster jar. He preached for 10 minutes. Then he asked the congregation, Is there anything we should pray for this week? Mrs. Carter said her sister was in the hospital. Mr. Davis said his grandson had got into the college. Then there was a silence, and Hank Coleman raised his hand. He had not raised his hand in church in 20 years. Pastor Whitfield nodded. Brother Coleman, Hank stood up. My family's farm is being sold by the bank next Sunday. The congregation went still. I'm not asking for prayer for the farm. The farm is the farm. It's land. It'll go to whoever it goes to. I'm asking for prayer for me. I'm asking for prayer that I can walk in there and walk out and not have it kill me. He sat down. The silence held. Pastor Whitfield said quietly, Brother Coleman, come up here. Hank stood up again. He walked to the front. The 14 old men and women stood up around him. Pastor Whitfield put one hand on his shoulder and one hand on his head, and he prayed, not loud, just talking, the way Pastor Whitfield always prayed, like he was reasoning with God on a porch. Lord, this is a good man. He has farmed this land that you gave his great-grandfather. He has farmed it with care like the woman with the alabaster jar. He has not held back the precious thing. Now, Lord, the world is asking him to give up the jar, to break it. We do not ask you to spare him from breaking. We ask only that he break with grace, that he walk through this with the dignity that the men of his family have always walked through everything, that you remind him when he is alone in his fear that he is not alone, that his ancestors are with him, that the people of this congregation are with him, that you are with him. We ask in the name of Jesus. The congregation said, Amen. Hank stood at the front for a long moment. He could not move. Then Pastor Whitfield squeezed his shoulder and turned him gently and walked him back to his seat. Ruth took his hand. After the service, Pastor Whitfield walked Hank to the door. Brother Coleman, Pastor, whatever happens on Sunday, you have done well. You have done your father's work. You have done your great-grandfather's work. You hold this in your mind. I will, Pastor. And one more thing. Yes. You said walking in is the hardest thing. You're right. But sometimes the Lord arranges it so that walking in is not as hard as you feared. Be open to that. Sometimes the Lord arranges other people to make the walking in easier. If that happens, you let them. You hear me. You don't be too proud to be loved. Hank looked at him for a long time. Yes, Pastor. All right. He walked out into the cold. The day before the auction, Hank drove into town to pay his electric bill. He had been paying it in person at the courthouse for 35 years. He could have mailed it. He had never mailed it. He parked behind the courthouse. He walked across the square. The square was empty. It was a Saturday afternoon. The wind was up. Nobody was out. He paid his bill at the window. Mrs. Henning, who had been at the window since 1967, took the cash and stamped the receipt. She said, Mr. Coleman, Mrs. Henning, I'll see you next month. She had never said that before, in 35 years of receipts. She had always said, thank you, Mr. Coleman, that's all, and that was the whole transaction. She said, I'll see you next month. He looked at her. Yes, ma'am. Have a good day, Mr. Coleman. Yes, ma'am. He walked out. He stopped on the courthouse steps and looked at the empty square. He didn't know yet. He didn't know what was coming the next morning. But Mrs. Henning had said, I'll see you next month, and Mrs. Henning had never said that, and there was a thing in the air of the square that he could not name. He stood for a moment with the wind on his face, and he thought, something. There is a something. He could not see it, but it was there. He drove home. The night before the auction, Hank slept 5 hours. It was the most he had slept in a week. He didn't know why. Some part of him had quieted. Some part of him had given up arguing with the thing that was coming, and the giving up had let his body rest. He woke at 4. Ruth was already awake beside him. She had not turned on the light. What are we going to do today? She said. What we always do. What's that? Coffee, eggs. Feed the animals, walk the place. Then go. All right. He got up. He put on his clothes. He had laid them out the night before. The same shirt Joseph Coleman had worn to the funeral of his brother who died in Korea. The same boots Hank had worn for 15 years. A sport coat that had been Solomon's, restored in 1944 by a tailor in Omaha, wool and still good. He did not own a tie. He had never owned a tie. He had buried his father in a borrowed one. He went down the stairs slowly. The kitchen was warm. The stove had been banked. He stoked it and put coffee on. He looked out the window. The sky was still black. The auction was at 10. He had 6 hours. He walked the place. Start at the porch. Go east first, because that is where the morning comes from. Walk to the corner of the home quarter at the windbreak. Touch the cottonwoods Solomon had planted. Walk south along the fence line to the creek. Stand at the creek. Walk west and north. Touch the barn. Walk back to the house. He took his time. He stood at the cottonwood for a long while. He stood at the creek for longer. The creek was frozen except for one place where the spring fed in, and at that place there was a small black opening of moving water. He stood and watched it move. Solomon had stood at this creek in 1882. Hank tried to think about that. He could not quite fit it in his mind. 102 years. The same creek, the same water moving through the same opening in the ice. He thought about his father. He thought about the piece of mortar in Joseph's hip. He thought about how Joseph had walked the rest of his life with a small rocking motion that Hank had not known was a limp until he was 17, because that was just how his father walked. He thought about the day in 1953 when Joseph had taken him to a parade in Lincoln for veterans, and a white veteran in a wheelchair had spit at Joseph's feet, and Joseph had not said anything, had just turned Hank by the shoulder and walked him the other way. Hank had been 30 before he asked his mother why his father had gone to that parade at all. His mother had said, "Because his name was on the list of invitees, Henry. Your father did not believe in pretending he was not invited." He stood at the creek and thought. Joseph went to the parade. He went anyway. And Hank thought, "I am going to the auction. I am going anyway. That is what we do." He walked through the equipment shed. The combine was there, the John Deere with the new belt. Wayne Crocker had charged him cash for. The grain truck, the Ford pickup that had been Joseph's. He touched each of them once. Then he walked back to the house. The sun was up. Ruth had eggs ready. They ate together. They didn't talk much. At 8:45 they put their coats on. At 9 they got in the truck. He drove the 7 miles into town. When he came around the last bend, before the courthouse square, where the auction was set, he slowed the truck. Slowed the truck because the square was full. It was full of trucks, pickups and beat farm trucks and old sedans. He could not see the courthouse for the trucks. There were trucks parked along Main Street for 3 blocks. There were trucks on the side streets. There were trucks in the church lot. There were men in coats standing in clumps by the trucks, smoking, hands in pockets, breathing steam. Hank stopped his truck. He sat with his hands on the wheel. "Ruth," he said. "Yes, what is this? I don't know. Did you know about this?" "No." She was lying. He knew she was lying. He had been married to her for 40 years. He said, "Tell me," she said. "I told Mary Stenlin 3 weeks ago. That's all I did," I told one woman. He looked at the square again. He counted trucks in his head. He gave up at 43. He said, "Ruth." She said, "I know." He said, "You shouldn't have." She said, "I know." He said, "I'd asked you not to." She said, "I know." She didn't apologize. He didn't want her to. He sat with his hands on the wheel and the engine running, and he tried to make himself drive the last 200 yards, and he could not. His hands wouldn't go. She put her hand on his. "Come on, Henry." "Ruth." "It's already done. They're already here. The least we can do is walk into it." He breathed once. He breathed twice. He drove into the square. He parked behind the courthouse. He got out. Ruth got out. They walked together through the trucks. He saw faces he knew. Carl Hoffman, leaning on a fender. Walter Drennan with his hands in his pockets. Carl Gentry with his shovel hand resting on the bed of his pickup, as though he had brought the hand and only the hand and forgotten the body for a second. Eugene Heights with a grin. Hank had never quite trusted on most days but trusted today. Walter Gunderson, Harold Finch, Roy Hathel, Chester Holloway, Tommy Westcott's wife Pearl, holding Tommy's coat over her arm because Tommy had already gone up to the bid stand. Eleanor Whitmore in a long gray coat near the courthouse steps, talking quietly to a man in a navy suit Hank did not recognize. 2 women he did not know who nodded at him as he passed. Rudy Stenland at the front of the crowd. Eugene Pratt at the front of the crowd beside Rudy, the chain on his shoulder, the chain. Hank had not thought of the chain since 1949, when Eugene had used it to pull Joseph Coleman's tractor out of the gully at the south end of the home quarter, and Hank, who had been 12, had stood in the field and watched the chain, that big move A thing that big, with a slowness that had seemed to him at 12 to be the slowness of God. And Joseph Coleman had said quietly to him, "Son, there is no force in this world that beats the right tool used right." Hank had remembered that line for 35 years. He had forgotten where he had first heard it. He saw the chain now on Eugene Pratt's shoulder, and he remembered. Eugene Jr. was there too. At the back, he had not come up to the front. He had not put his hand in his pocket and stood beside his father. But he had come. Hank saw him from across the crowd. They nodded at each other. It was not enough. It was not nothing. A man stepped up beside Hank. It was Rudy. "Hank, Rudy, you weren't supposed to see this until you got here." "Well, I'm here. You all right?" "No, will you be? In a minute. Take your minute." Hank stood. He nodded to Carl Hoffman. He nodded to Walter Drennan. He raised his eyes once to Eugene Pratt, and Eugene Pratt nodded back, and that was the whole of what they said to each other. Then Hank said to Rudy, "Where's Preston Calloway?" Rudy lifted his chin. "Up by the steps with the bank." Hank looked. Preston Calloway was standing on the courthouse steps in his tan overcoat and his polished shoes. There were 3 other men with him in suits. 2 of them were lawyers. One of them was Roland Barkley. They were looking at the crowd with the faces men make when they are doing arithmetic they did not expect to do. Hank looked at Preston Calloway. Preston Calloway saw him. Preston Calloway looked away. That was when Hank started to feel it. The thing he had not had a word for in the truck. He felt it now. It was the opposite of shame. He had been carrying shame for 3 weeks, the way a man carries a bag of feed up a stairway. Shoulder bent, breath short, the weight working into his vertebrae. The thing rising in him now was the bag coming off the shoulder. It was lightness. It was almost terrifying how light. He had been told, in 200 small ways across his life, that he was a problem to be managed, that his land was a thing to be efficiently transferred, that his neighbors would not stand for him. He stood in the courthouse square at 9:53 on a Sunday morning, February of 1984, and his neighbors were standing for him. And he had not asked them to, and he did not know how to thank them, and the thing in him said, maybe they don't want to be thanked. Maybe they want to be answered. He stood up straight. He walked through the crowd to the front, with Ruth on his arm, and he stood at the front of the crowd next to Rudy Stenland and Eugene Pratt, and he turned and faced the courthouse steps where Preston Calloway and Roland Barkley and the 2 lawyers were standing, and he did not say anything. He just stood. At 10 o'clock, Tommy Westcott climbed up onto the bid stand. Tommy was 67. He had a face like a kind dog. He wore a coat that had been too large for him for 10 years. He climbed up and he tapped the microphone twice, and the square went quiet. It went quiet in a way Hank had never heard a public space go quiet. It was not the quiet of waiting. It was the quiet of attention. 200 and some men and women deciding, all at once, to listen. Tommy looked out over the crowd. He did not stutter. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said. His voice came out clear and steady through the speakers. "We are gathered here today on the matter of the foreclosure sale of the property known as the Coleman Place, located at the southwest quarter and the northwest quarter of Section 11, Township 31, Range 36, Crawford County, Nebraska. The lender of record is Riverside Bank of Crawford. The lender is represented today by Mr. Roland Barkley, manager. The sale is conducted under the laws of the state of Nebraska." He paused. He looked at Roland Barkley. Roland Barkley nodded. "The opening bid as set by the lender is $63,000. There was no movement in the crowd. Tommy waited. He was a professional. He waited the right amount. 63,000. Do I hear 63? Silence. A breath of wind moved across the square. An old woman near the back coughed once into her glove. A young man in a denim coat at the edge of the courthouse lot took off his hat and held it in front of him with both hands. A boy of about 10, standing beside his father near the steps, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and his father put a hand on his shoulder, and the boy stood still. Carl Gentry, near the front, dug the heel of his boot into the cold ground a half-inch deeper and stayed. Walter Gunderson, 2 men back, took a slow breath in through his nose and let it out and stayed. Harold Finch, at the edge of the steps, held a small notebook in his hand. He had brought it for reasons he could not have explained. He stood with the notebook closed in his hand and stayed. Roy Hassel, near a parked truck, had grease on the cuff of his coat. He had been under a tractor at 5:30 that morning. He stood with grease on his cuff and stayed. 200 men and women stayed. Do I hear any bid at all from the floor? Eugene Heights stepped forward 1/2 step. He raised his right hand. He held up a single coin between his thumb and forefinger. He said, loud enough that the men at the back of the square heard it without effort, 1 penny. Tommy nodded. 1 penny. I have a bid of 1 cent from the floor. Do I hear 63,000? Silence. Do I hear 63,000 from the lender or any party? Roland Barkley opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at Preston Calloway. Preston Calloway was already moving. Preston Calloway stepped forward to the bottom of the courthouse steps, and he raised his hand. He said, 63,000. Tommy said, Sir, may I have your name and your authority? Preston said, Preston Calloway. Cattleman's Equity Group. I am acting on behalf of an investor. Tommy said, Sir, the lender has the first right of bid up to the loan amount. Mr. Barkley, do you wish to make a bid? Roland Barkley was a man in a brown suit. He had been the manager of the Riverside Bank for 9 years. He had clicked a ballpoint pen at Henry Coleman in January and told him a lie that they both knew was a lie. 2 days ago, on Friday afternoon, his telephone had rung in his office, and a voice he did not know had told him, politely, that the board would be considering his employment on Monday morning, and that any deviation from posted procedure on Sunday would be the first item on the agenda. He stood now on the courthouse steps, and he opened his mouth and he looked across the square. 200 men and women were looking at him. In the very front row, 2 yards from him, was Eugene Pratt. The chain was on Eugene Pratt's shoulder. Eugene Pratt was not threatening anyone. He was just standing. He was a big man, and he was just standing, and he was looking at Roland Barkley with the kind of patient, flat look a man has when he is deciding anything because the deciding is done. Behind Eugene Pratt was Carl Hoffman. Carl was 81. Carl had buried a brother 3 years before because of a bank decision. Carl was looking at Roland Barkley too. Behind Carl was a row of men Roland Barkley had known his whole life. He had sold them mortgages. He had refinanced them. He had taken some of them to lunch. He had eaten dinner at the Stenland farm in 1979 with his wife. He had pulled Walter Drennan's son out of a snowdrift in 1976. They were all looking at him. Beyond them, near the steps, was Eleanor Whitmore in a gray coat with a man in a navy suit. Roland Barkley closed his mouth. He shook his head once. He said, The bank will not bid. Tommy nodded. Mr. Calloway, you have made a bid of 63,000. Sir, may I see your funds? Preston said. I have a certified check. Tommy said, Sir, the rules of this auction require funds for the bid amount to be presented at the time of the winning bid. Funds for bids in excess of 1 cent must be presented before the bid is accepted from the floor. Sir, do you have a certified check in the amount of 63,000 on your person now? Preston said. I have authorization. I have a wire ready. Tommy said, A wire is not certified funds at the time of bid, sir. The terms of this auction are as posted. Funds at time of bid. Preston said, I will have the funds within the hour. Tommy said, The auction does not pause for bids without funds, sir. Mr. Barclay, is the bank prepared to accept Mr. Calloway's bid on terms that depart from the posted terms? Roland Barclay looked at Preston Calloway. Preston Calloway was looking at Roland Barclay with an expression that had started as confidence and was beginning to be something else. There was a thin line of sweat at Preston's hairline. Hank could see it from the front row. He had not expected to see anything on Preston Calloway. He saw it. Eleanor Whitmore was standing with her hands folded. Roland Barclay said, "The bank will require the posted terms." Preston Calloway said, "Roland." Roland said, "Posted terms, Mr. Calloway." Preston said, "We talked about this. We had a—" Roland said carefully, "The bank requires posted terms." Preston Calloway turned his head a quarter inch and looked at Eleanor Whitmore. He had not looked at her before. He looked at her now. She did not look back. She did not need to. The not looking was the thing. Preston Calloway opened his mouth and closed it. Tommy Westcott waited the proper amount of time. Then Tommy said, "I have a bid of $63,000 from Mr. Calloway, contingent upon funds which the lender is unwilling to accept on those terms. The bid is therefore withdrawn for lack of funds at time of bid. The standing bid is 1 cent. Do I hear any other bid from the floor?" Silence. "Do I hear any other bid?" Silence. Tommy raised his gavel. He looked across the square. He looked at Hank Coleman. Hank stood street. Tommy looked back at the crowd. Going once, silence. Going twice, silence. The gavel came down. Sold for 1 cent to Mr. Eugene Heights of Crawford County. There was no cheer. That was the part Hank remembered most. Later, when he tried to tell Sarah about it, there was no cheer. 200 people did not cheer. They did not shout. They did not clap each other on the back. They simply stood. That was the dignity of it. Cheering would have been for them. Standing was for him. Eugene Heights walked up to the bid stand. He handed Tommy 1 penny. Tommy received it. Tommy handed it to Roland Barclay. Roland Barclay received it. Roland Barclay signed the papers. Eugene Heights turned around. He walked through the crowd. He came up to Hank. He held out the deed. He said, "Mr. Coleman, I am pleased to announce that I have purchased your farm. Now, I'm an old man and a poor administrator, and I find I am not in a position to hold real estate at this time. Would you consider taking it off my hands for 1 cent?" Hank reached into his pocket. He had not put a penny in his pocket that morning. He had not known to. Ruth beside him opened her purse and pressed a penny into his hand. She had put it there at 4:30 that morning, while he was still asleep. He handed the penny to Eugene Heights. Eugene Heights handed him the deed. Hank held the deed. It was a piece of paper. It was for generations. He did not cry. He had said he would not cry, and he did not cry. But he did for 1 moment close his eyes. And behind his closed eyes, he saw his father standing in the south field in 1959 with a hand on the hood of the John Deere. And he saw Isaiah at 91 carrying a bucket of water from the pump because he refused to let anyone else carry it for him. And he saw Solomon walking into the territory with no shoes for the last 100 miles. And he saw the Pawnee woman named Star handing Solomon a piece of squash. And he saw all of them at once. And around them, in a wider circle, he saw 200 men and women in a courthouse square in February. And he saw an old woman in a gray coat with her hands folded, and he saw a stuttering auctioneer who had not stuttered for a single syllable. And he saw a daughter in Chicago who he understood now had not slept for 3 weeks, who had picked up a phone and made a call, who had pulled records and made another call, who had set a thing in motion that he had not seen because she had not wanted him to see it, because she had wanted him to be the man on this morning and not the saved one. And he opened his eyes and he looked at the people who had come for him, and he said, loud enough for the first row to hear, "Thank you." It was all he said. He had expected to say more. The more was unnecessary. The people nodded and broke up. They went to their trucks. They drove home. There was no party. Carl Hoffman touched the brim of his hat as he passed Hank. Carl Gentry walked past him and stopped. He said, "Hank Coleman." Hank said, "Carl." Carl said, "I dug a well on your great-grandfather's place in 1938. He paid me in your great-grandmother's bread. Tell your wife she has good company in the kitchen going back. That's all." Then he walked on to his truck. Eugene Pratt nodded once and moved his shoulder so the chain shifted and walked back toward his pickup. Then he stopped, halfway to the truck. He turned around. He looked across the square at his son. Eugene Jr. was still standing at the back, not looking at his father, looking at the courthouse steps where Preston Calloway was talking quietly and angrily to one of the lawyers in suits. Eugene Sr. walked across the square to his son. He did not say anything for a minute. He just stood beside him. Eugene Jr. said, "Pop." Eugene Sr. said, "I saw you." Eugene Jr. says, "I came late." Eugene Sr. said, "You came." Eugene Jr. said, "I didn't stand at the front." Eugene Sr. said, "No, you didn't. Maybe next time." Eugene Jr. was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Pop, the hardware store opens at noon. I have to." Eugene Sr. said, "Go open it. I'll come by Tuesday." He clapped his son once on the shoulder, light, and walked back to his pickup with the chain still over his arm. Eleanor Whitmore did not come over to Hank. She nodded across the square and turned and got in a black car and was driven away. The man in the navy suit went with her. Tommy Westcott packed up the bid stand and packed it carefully, and did not stutter even when his wife came up to him and asked him if he was all right. He said, "I'm all right, Pearl, I'm all right." Then he stuttered slightly on the word right. Then he laughed at himself quietly, and Pearl laughed too. Hank and Ruth drove home in silence. They did not speak for the first mile. They left the courthouse square behind them. They left the trucks behind them. The county road opened in front of them, flat and white, and Hank drove the way he had driven it 10,000 times, and the world looked the same as it had looked at 9 that morning, and the world was not the same. In the second mile he said finally, "Ruth." She said, "Yes." He said, "You told one woman." She said, "Yes." He said, "One woman." She said, "Yes." He drove a while. He said, "I was wrong this morning." She said, "I know you were." He said, "I'm not going to apologize for being wrong." She said, "I don't need you to." He drove a while. He said, "Thank you, Ruth." She said, "You're welcome, Henry." They drove the rest of the way home in the kind of silence a 40-year marriage makes, which is not absence of speech but presence without it. Sarah called that night. She did not ask if it had worked. She knew already. She had heard from the lawyer in Lincoln. She just said, "Daddy, yes, baby. Are you all right? I am all right." Then he said quietly, "Sarah, the pad and the legal calls." There was a pause. "Yes, you did not sleep." "No. For how many nights?" "All of them." "Sarah, Daddy." "Thank you." She did not say anything. He could hear her breathing. "Daddy, yes." "You always told me. You said, you go where you can be a person. The land will be here." I went. "But I never thought. I always thought I had left the land behind, Daddy. I always thought going was leaving. This week I learned. Going wasn't leaving. Going was going so that when something needed doing in a place I didn't live anymore, I would have the tools to do it. You sent me away on purpose, Daddy, didn't you?" He thought about it. "I sent you away because I wanted you to have a life," he said. "I didn't know about the tools. I didn't think that far. Your mother might have. She thinks longer than me." "All right, Daddy." "Sarah, yes. Bring my grandson out in April. He needs to see this place." "I will, Daddy. Tell him about Solomon." "I will. Tell him about Solomon walking in." "I will." He hung up. He sat at the kitchen table with Ruth. They did not eat much. The day had taken everything out of them. Ruth said after a while, "Henry." "Yes. I want to say something." "All right. I am going to say it once, then I won't say it again. All right, she said. I have been your wife for 40 years. I have watched you carry a thing your whole life. I have watched you carry it every day. I have watched you decide every morning not to let it bend you. I want you to know, I have always known, that what you carried was not yours to carry alone. The men today knew it too. Some of them have known it their whole lives. Some of them only learned this month, but they all knew it today. And I want you to know, going forward, when you are tempted to think that you are alone. And I know my husband, Henry. I know that the temptation will come back. That's the nature of what was put on you. I want you to remember this morning. I want you to remember that the bag came off the shoulder. And I want you to remember that the men who took it off were not strangers. They were neighbors, who you had been a neighbor to for 40 years, without knowing it. That is what neighborliness is, Henry. It is the credit you build without intending to, by being the man you are when nobody is watching. And then one day, everybody is watching and the credit comes back. I want you to remember that. When the temptation comes back, and it will. He looked at her. Ruth, yes. I will. Good. She put her hand on his. Now eat your dinner. He ate his dinner. The next morning, Hank picked up the phone in the hall and dialed the AME mission in Omaha. It rang 4 times. Pastor Whitfield answered. Pastor, Brother Coleman, it's done. I heard. Who told you? Mrs. Carter's nephew was at the auction. He's a pharmacist in town. He called his aunt. His aunt called me at 6 this morning. Hank smiled faintly. News travels. It does, Brother Coleman. There was a pause. Hank said, Pastor, you said something to me on Sunday. You said sometimes the Lord arranges other people. You said don't be too proud to be loved. I did. I want to tell you, I let them. Most of them I didn't even know were there until I saw them. But the ones I knew, I let them. Pastor Whitfield was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Brother Coleman, I want you to do me a favor. Yes, Pastor? I want you to sit down at your kitchen table sometime this week and write down their names, every one of them. I want you to write the names where your grandson can find them in 50 years. I do not want those names to live only in your memory. Memory dies with men. Paper does not. Hank said, Yes, Pastor, and one more thing, yes. When the temptation comes back to think you stand alone, and it will, I want you to take that paper out and read it. The names will not change. The number will not change. They came on a Sunday in February of 1984. They are not going to uncome. Yes, Pastor. All right, God bless you, Brother Coleman. And you, Pastor. He hung up. He sat at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil. He wrote names: Rudy Stenland, Eugene Pratt, Carl Hoffman, Tommy Wess, Carl Gentry, Walter Drennan, Walter Gunderson, Harold Finch, Roy Hassel, Chester Holloway, Eleanor Whitsland, Pearl Westcott. Eugene Pratt, Jr., at the back, but he had come. Pastor James Whitfield, Daniel Mercer in Lincoln, Leland Marcus, Sarah, Ruth. He wrote until the page was full. He folded it. He put it in the family Bible on the shelf above the table, between the pages where Solomon's name was written and Joseph's name was written, and he did not take it out for a long time. Sarah brought Michael out in April. Michael was 8 years old. He had been on the farm twice in his life. This time he stayed 2 weeks. Hank took him on the same walk he had taken with himself the morning of the auction. Start at the porch, go east, touch the cottonwood, walk south to the creek. Stand at the creek, walk west and north, touch the barn, come back to the house. At the cottonwood, Hank stopped. He put Michael's small hand on the bark. This tree was planted by your great-great-grandfather, he said. His name was Solomon. He was born a slave in Tennessee. He walked off F 1862. He walked here. He planted this tree in 1888. It has been standing for 100 years. It will stand for 100 more. Michael looked up at the tree. He did not say anything for a minute. Then he said, "Grandpa." "Yes. Did Solomon walk all the way without shoes? For the last 100 miles, why didn't he have shoes? They wore out." Michael thought about that. Why didn't he stop and rest? Because if he stopped, he might not start again. Michael thought about that too. "Grandpa, yes. Will you tell me what happened in February?" Hank looked down at his grandson. He had thought about how to do this. He had thought about it for 2 months. He had decided finally that he would tell it the way it had happened. And he would not protect Michael from any of it, because Michael was Solomon Coleman's blood, and a child of that blood deserved the truth. But standing now at the cottonwood with the boy's hand under his, he found himself saying it short. He said, 3 hard years came. The bank wanted to take the farm. A man came from the city to buy it cheap. He thought I would sell because I was tired and because I was a black man without much fight left. And he was wrong on both counts, but mostly on the second one. The neighbors heard. They came on the morning of the auction. 200 of them. They stood in the square and they did not bid. The man from the city left without the farm. The farm stayed with us. Michael thought, why did the neighbors come? Because they were neighbors. They knew you? Some of them did. Most of them just knew of me. Why was that enough? Hank was quiet for a moment. He looked out over the field. He said, Michael, when you live somewhere for a long time, and you do your work, and you do not cheat anyone, and you take care of your own, and you help when you are asked, and sometimes when you are not asked, people notice. They do not always say so. They might not say so for 40 years, but they notice, and one day when you need them, they show up. Not because you asked, because you earned it without trying to earn it, by being the man you were going to be anyway. He paused. That's one lesson, there's another. What's the other? The other is harder. The other is that some people will not show up. Some people you grew up with. Some people who played catch with you when you were boys, they will not show up, and you cannot let the ones who don't show up matter more than the ones who do. You have to count the ones who came. He pointed across the field. That truck driving by, that's Carl Hoffman. He came, he's 81. He came in a coat that was older than your mother. Michael watched the truck. The man with the chain was named Eugene Pratt. The auctioneer was named Tommy Westcott. The man who bought the farm for 1 cent and gave it back to me was named Eugene Heights. The woman who quietly arranged the bank was named Eleanor Whitmore. The man who knocked on every door was named Rudy Stenland. The woman who told one other woman that we needed help was your grandmother. Your mother in Chicago, made phone calls all night for 3 weeks that nobody knew about. Those are the names. You will know those names. You will tell them to your children. Michael said, Yes, Grandpa, and one more thing, yes. You will not be a farmer, Michael. You may. You may not. That is not what I am asking. I am asking, when somebody you barely know is in trouble, and you could stand for him, and standing would cost you something, you stand. You hear me? Yes. You stand even if you have to leave a job. You stand even if it costs you a friend who turns out not to have been a friend. You stand even if your own father won't stand. Do you hear me? He was thinking, as he said it, of Eugene Jr., who had stood at the back, who had at least come. Yes, Grandpa. And the last thing, yes. Don't let anybody tell you you owe nothing to people you've never met. You owe everything to people you've never met. Solomon never met you. He walked here for you. You owe him. You owe him by walking the way he walked. You owe him by being a man who other men will stand for. You owe him by passing it on. He squeezed his grandson's hand on the bark, then he let go. They walked the rest of the way to the creek together. The sun was higher now. The frozen part of the creek had broken up and the water was moving everywhere, fast and clear. Michael bent down and put his hand in it. He pulled his hand out fast. It's cold. Yes. Did Solomon stand here? Yes, in this exact spot. Hank looked at the bend of the creek. He looked at the bank. He thought about it. Maybe not this exact spot, he said, but close. Michael nodded. They stood at the creek for a long time, not saying anything. The man and the boy, the great-great-grandson of the man who had walked into the territory in 1862, and the great-grandfather of children not yet born, watching the cold water move past the spot where, more than a century before, an exhausted man with no shoes had been pointed north by a woman who fed him squash, and they did not say anything else, because everything that needed saying had been said, and the work now was to remember it. They walked back to the house. Ruth had lunch ready. They ate together. After lunch, Michael went out to the barn with his grandfather to learn how to grease a bearing. Hank showed him. The boy's hands were small. They were going to grow. Inside, on the shelf above the kitchen table, the family Bible held a folded piece of paper between the page where Solomon's name was written and the page where Joseph's name was written. The paper had a list on it. The list would not change. The number on it would not change. The land was his. It always had been. It always would be.